morning, everyone. This is Kathy Mason from MasonWorks Marketing here on Conscious Business Zone. Today with my new friend, Paul Anthony Wallis. Hi, Paul. How are you?
G'day, Kathy. I'm great. Thanks so much for having me on today.
Oh, I'm so glad we could do this. I know we're in such different time zones. I'm in Colorado in the US, and you are?
I'm just outside the Australian Capital Territory in New South Wales.
Isn't that wonderful? This is what technology is so fantastic about. And as long as we can coordinate our time zones.
I know, because we're even in different days.
I know. What's the future like?
It's okay. I'm still here. So.
I think I will be too. That's great. So you guys, I wanted you to meet Paul because I am so excited about his presentations on the real information for history that we really want to know now. We are going through a huge time of change, and we're going to be finally informed of what our historical origins are. And so I want you to know Paul's an internationally best-selling author. His books probe world mythologies and ancestral narratives for their insights into human origins, human potential, and our place in the cosmos. And I love this subject. He wrote in 2020, wrote a best-selling book called Escaping from Eden. And George Noory, our good friend from Gaia TV, and from
Coast to Coast.
Coast to Coast, thanks. He said that George Noory said that this generation's Chariot of the Gods book, he said that the Escaping from Eden was hailed as well as important as Chariots of the Gods, which is a huge compliment. And then he also, your next book is The Scars of Eden. And now you're going to have a new book called Echoes of Eden that's already available to be bought, pre-bought on Amazon. So let's go back because I kind of didn't do a very good job of introducing you. You have had a experience and a history of working within religion and that education and that what do you want to even call it, that organization, the paradigm of it. So do you want to start how you started on this questioning the stories that you were taught or watching?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Well, yes,
Thanks.
my professional background is in Christian ministry. And I worked for 33 years in church-based ministry as a theological educator, training pastors in hermeneutics, which is the principles of interpreting ancient texts. I worked as a church doctor and an archdeacon for the Anglican Church in Australia. That's one down from a bishop. And it's kind of a troubleshooting role where you go in and you guide faith communities through conflict resolution, appointment processes, interim processes to help them turn a corner or change gear. So that was the kind of work that I did for 33 years. And I really enjoyed working in that area. And I enjoyed the fact that it forced me to engage with ancient texts, the Bible in particular. But all through that time, while I was preaching from the Bible and then training pastors in how to handle it, I was confronting myself on a regular basis with anomalies in the stories we tell from the Bible, things that don't quite make sense, translation questions that are a little bit of a moot point. And I would always promise myself that I would get back at some point and really drill down into what was going on there. But in terms of questioning the narrative, I think that's something I've always had from long before I became a Christian, because I'd came to faith later when I was 17 years old. And prior to that, I'd been a fairly convinced atheist.
Oh.
And what got me onto that track was something that happened when I was no more than 6 years old. And I have a feeling I was 5 when this happened. But I remember very clearly, it was a Monday morning at school, and we had the school assembly, and our principal, Mrs. May, said, Mrs. Clark's class are now going to come in and teach us a new hymn. And Mrs. Clark was the only one of the teachers in our little Church of England school who could play the piano. So she came in, and her class sang this hymn that began with the words, when Jesus was a little boy. And the hymn went on to say, when Jesus was a little boy, he was perfectly well behaved. He didn't give his teachers any trouble. He always did what his mum and dad told him. He was a perfect model little boy, and so children should you be. And I sat there at no more than 6, I think I was 5, listening to this hymn thinking, this is pathetic. They are just trying to get us to toe the line, and they're using Jesus as a way of getting us to do it. And I went home and I told this to my dad, and I said, you know, they talk about God as if they know what they're talking about, but I don't think they've ever seen God. And for all they know, God could be some giant green dragon. And I had no idea at that time how much truth was in those words. I really was getting a sense of how organized religion can be very manipulative,
Yes.
of how the institution can hijack Jesus and start putting out a totally different message to what he represented, because they're just trying to manage the school full of crazy kids. So I was getting that. But then I'd also spoken a truth that I had no idea about, and that is that the Bible is full of dragon stories that have been translated as something else. So I had that kind of, I'm not sure about this mind from the get-go. And then when I was 11, I was introduced by my mum and dad, in fact, to the writings of Erich Von Daniken. So Erich Von Daniken has been in my mind since that age, and I felt that he had really put his finger on our inability to explain ourselves as a conscious, intelligent species. Because when my church school said, we human beings are God's special and unique creation, I would want to know, well, how come it's so obvious we're a kind of primate? If we're God's special creation, how come we're so similar to all the other animals? And then if you went to science for an explanation of why we are the alpha species on the planet, well, it's because of our higher consciousness and our higher intelligence. Well, how did we get that? Well, we're not sure. And so there's this gap. And Erich Von Daniken put his finger on that, and he said, would the picture be more coherent if we allowed for the possibility of an external intervention in our development as a species that did something from the outside to upgrade our capacity for intelligence, consciousness, technology? And I read that at the age of 11, and I thought, yes, that would make more sense. And so all that was sitting in my mind for a long, long time, until after more than 30 years in the ministry, I returned to some of the questions that he had raised and felt I needed to devote some time to them and approach it with the skills I'd developed, which are to do with interpretation of texts, analysis of texts, translation of ancient languages, and go at it that way. And it was that that opened up the whole world of paleocontact for me.
I find it's fascinating how our soul navigates and does such a beautiful job of giving us experiences at just the right time for our development. I mean, for you to get that book at 11 and actually remember it, I mean, the book, for you at 11 to have gotten it and remembered it as a boy when you could have been out playing soccer or doing something else. I mean,
that's really kudos to Erich Von Daniken, because I was not the only child of that age talking about Chariots of the Gods at the time. My mum and dad were talking about it with their friends at dinner parties.
Oh,
And I think the book had been out for about a decade,
yeah.
but I think the film had recently been shown or
Uh,
reshown on the TV. So it was really in the air. And so I take my hat off to Erich Von Daniken for breaking the taboo and making it part of mainstream conversation. And at that time, it really was. And I just really latched onto it and thought there's something here that's really important.
I so love this conversation because I think that there's several things. We're evolving right now to another level of humanity. Fingers crossed. And what Barbara Marx Hubbard called us the Homo universalis, she said was birth 2012. And this new human has claimed their superpowers and is telepathic, which right now we would have to clean up a lot of our thoughts in order to be, well, you think about
to
it.
operate with that. Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to share is I got to help Greg Braden do a fundraiser for a church in Denver 2 years ago, before the lockdown. And they raised enough money to replace the roof on the building, which was so cool. The Althea Center. And he actually showed slides of the CRISPR. Are you familiar with the CRISPR, which is the technology to use on DNA to replace chromosomes? Okay, well,
No.
there is technology that's being used now in the earth, in science, to change our DNA. And he showed how our DNA was altered.
Yes.
And he had slides of it that looked like an X and there was a little jag in it. And he said, we barely have the technology now to do it. And should we even be doing it is the other question.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, well, the thing is that the people that created us knew the multi-dimensional ramifications, but do we know that? I assume they knew the multi-dimensional, maybe not, I don't know.
Well, I would put a little question mark over that because
Uh-oh.
of what I discovered in the Popol Vuh, which is the Mayan story of human origins.
Okay.
And I discovered that for myself pretty quickly after I started doing this translation work, because I discovered through doing that when you make some translation choices on the basis of etymological meanings rather than the traditional interpretations, it flips the Bible stories of origins around in such a way that they line up in parallel with world mythologies and ancestral narratives all around the world. The way the Bible's translated at the moment, it's as if it's saying, forget what every other culture in the world has said. This is what really happened.
Yes.
But with these translation switches, it becomes clear the Bible stories of beginnings are a summary form of the Mesopotamian ones, the Babylonian, Assyrian, Akkadian, Sumerian stories. And then from there, in Escaping from Eden, I go around the world and I get quite quickly to Mesoamerica, to the Mayan story. And they have a very frank story about visitors coming to the planet in the deep past and genetically modifying our ancestors with a view to creating a working class. They want a Homo sapiens that is clever enough to be able to work for them, but not too clever. And they're very frank about their intent. And they're very frank about how difficult an exercise this was and how long a period of experimentation this was. And it's quite clear that at some point in that process, they produced a Homo sapiens that was far too conscious and too intelligent to want to work for them as their working class. What's intriguing about that, this moment when they get to Homo sapiens, 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 is that that moment occurs in ancestral narratives in other cultures as well. So if you go to Nigeria and you've got the story of a Bassi and a Thai genetically modifying our ancestors, trying to get Homo sapiens just where they want them, they again find they're too successful, they're too intelligent, too technological, and they have to find a way of dialing humanity down. Same is in the Greek narratives as well, where Prometheus gets in trouble for making Homo sapiens too clever, too technological. It's there in Genesis 11, this moment where we're all brought back down to a place where we're intelligent enough to work for and not too intelligent that we can't be managed. So I have a little theory as to why that happened. And my little theory is that those who engineer, because that's what the visitors were called in the Popol Vuh, underestimated the intelligence and consciousness that we carry from our animal heritage, from our mammal heritage, our earthling heritage. And that when they got to those latter stages in the experiments where they are fusing aspects of their own DNA with ours, they were suddenly surprised by how intelligent the outcome was. And the positive takeaway from those stories is that when they dialed us down, it was not through modifying our DNA again. It was through external agents. So in the Nigerian story, they released devices into the environment that will make us anxious and sick to dial us down.
Oh.
In the Mayan story, they release a vapor that when it's sprayed over human populations damages our neurological connections to dumb us down to a point where we're limited to our 5 physical senses. We can only perceive what's in our immediate environment. And then for anything beyond that, we have to rely on being told by an authority. And they found that that was very good, that was manageable. And in each of those scenarios, and the same with Babel in Genesis 11, the same with Prometheus, our DNA isn't dialed down. Something is put into the environment to dumb us down. And the positive take home from that is these brains can be switched on. We still have all this in our DNA waiting to be activated. And that is why the same cultures that curated these stories of beginnings have always curated mystical and shamanic protocols for waking people up again, re-engaging our higher cognitive abilities. And that's part of where I go in Echoes of Eden to say, well, what is that? How do we do that? What are those traditions? And how is it that that information has survived? And how can I put it to work?
Wow. So did you figure it out?
Well, I didn't have to sort of figure it out. I just had to find it. It really was a matter of rediscovering
Wow.
indigenous traditions, ancestral narratives, world mythologies, and listening with a different ear. Because a lot of the time, when we go to ancient texts, for instance, we have a presumption that either this is some kind of a moral tale, or we're going to read it in a fundamentalist way, like a diary entry. This is exactly what happened.
Right.
And either approach, I think, really misses the mark. As soon as I saw the extraordinary correlations from culture to culture, century to century, age to age, cultures that had no contact with each other, when I saw the detail in the correlations of their stories, I was impacted with the implication that what we're looking at is the retelling, the report of visual memory. And that this isn't a case of a book that's gone around the world and been rewritten by each culture. It's not an oral tradition that's gone around as Chinese whispers. It is a visual memory that each culture has found different language and different metaphor to report. And that means that we are looking at something that happened, that our ancestors saw, that they have reported even without fully understanding. And it's been curated so faithfully that we can go back to these stories and in the light of our knowledge and information say, I think I know what's going on here. We recognize genetic modification when we see it. We recognize a wormhole when it's described. We recognize a rocket launch when it's described. We've got language for interdimensional contact, remote communication, and it's all there in our ancient narratives. So we understand our origins differently, and we understand who we are differently in the light of it. And it was just a matter of sitting at the feet of these traditional cultures, reading their texts, listening to their stories, and allowing it to shift my worldview.
Fantastic. Well, my perspective came because one of my degrees in college, I got 2 degrees in 4 years, but one of them was art history. And I lived in Italy. I was lucky enough to go to school in Italy 5 different times.
Wonderful.
And study the Renaissance in Florence.
I did that as well.
You did?
I was at
What years?
I was at the Istituto Machiavelli
Oh, you did?
in
Okay.
the 1980s. So they treated us to some education on Renaissance art in
Oh,
Florence. So that was a
yeah.
wonderful experience. So I had a
Wasn't
little taster of what you were doing, Kathy.
Yeah, I was in what was it called? L'Università degli Studi Lettere e Filosofia in Florence, and my classes that I signed up for blindly, like a dumb college kid,
Yes.
was the gentleman that was my instructor. I still have the books downstairs. He recorded every single lecture, and he wrote the book. And so the classes were amazing, and you could look at the work and then go to the Uffizi or go, I mean,
Yeah.
it was all around. But what the reason why I brought it up is that it's so obvious when you look at the art that the stories are the same from culture to culture. And there is Leonardo da Vinci, there's lots of Renaissance art that has, and earlier art that has the Byzantine art. Lots of art has references to UFOs.
Yeah. Yes, they do. And it's funny, isn't it, that you look at these paintings that depict flying saucers in the sky, laser beams,
Yes.
the interaction, what we now call human interface going on. And it really is obvious what you're seeing. But if you ask the question, what's that? Then the art historian will say, well, that is just an artistic convention for portraying the supernatural. It's an artistic convention for portraying the power of God when it acts, you know, in 3 dimensions, which, if you think about it, is a non-answer. Why is it a convention?
Right.
Why do we paint it that way?
Because they decided it was.
There's I think my favorite of these anomalous paintings is Carlo Crivelli's The Annunciation.
Yes.
Which is, I always get the numbers wrong when I say the date of it, but it's from that period, and there is a flying saucer in the sky and a laser beam coming down and shining into something that Mary is wearing on her forehead.
Yes.
Now, that is nothing like how the texts describe the impregnation of Mary with Jesus.
That's right.
Okay, so it's a different story being told. And so when I first saw that painting, I thought it was a satire. You know, I thought it was a spoof.
Oh.
Someone had graffitied, you know, a classic.
Oh,
And then I was told, no, that actually is the painting. So it then raises the question, what would happen if we took the stories told by our art as seriously as the stories told by our texts? Because most certainly a different explanation of who Jesus was and what happened to Mary would emerge, and it would be part of a far bigger bunch of stories that would reframe our understanding of God, religion, and the human experience.
Exactly.
Our artists sometimes do this because they know exactly what they're doing. They do have another source of information, whether it's a text or it's passed on esoterically or it's channeled. I do think that in the creative process, we often download information without knowing That's what we're doing.
Right.
But for all those reasons, there is information in our artistic canon.
Well, you can look at Leonardo da Vinci's work. He actually wrote backwards. They had to use a mirror, and wasn't that he was dyslexic. He actually, it's almost like he was writing in code. Some of these people, you have to assume they were either from the future and came back, or they were in connection with higher mind. Let's put it that way.
Yes, that's a lovely way to put it, in connection with higher mind. And that could be for lots of different reasons. It's quite possible that Leonardo da Vinci had what we now call acquired savant syndrome, which is a real neurological phenomenon studied by peer-reviewed scientists around the world, where higher cognitive abilities are knocked into the on position by accident. Someone hits their head, they have a stroke, they have a central nervous system event, and they go into a coma, and then in the aftermath they come out and they can speak a language they couldn't speak before, or play an instrument they couldn't play before, or they are geniuses in higher mathematics or applied physics. Something has been switched on that was off before. And I love this field of study because it's so counterintuitive. An injury to the brain should not extend your abilities. And how do we have high abilities in our brains in the off position? What paradigm makes that possible? Well, I enjoy that topic because the paradigm that makes it possible is the same story I was telling before about the upgrading of our ancestors and then the downgrading, and then by accident, oh, whoop, this one switched back on. That could be the story of Leonardo da Vinci. Alternatively, he could have been what people call an indigo child or a star child, which is where there's something anomalous about that person's conception, development. They come out more conscious, more intelligent. So the painting I was just describing of the Annunciation, the impregnation of Mary by some unusual artificial means, that is exactly how the mother of Lao Tzu described what happened to her, apparently, how the mother of the Yellow Emperor described what happened to her, apparently, how the mother of Vipassana Buddha, the 22nd incarnation of Buddha before Siddhartha Gautama, described her conception, pregnancy, apparently. These stories, however we take them, are widespread. In the Bible, you have Jesus, John the Baptist, Isaac. Those are all examples of women who naturally should not have become pregnant, becoming pregnant after a close encounter. And then the people who result from those pregnancies, highly intelligent, highly conscious, with an amazing contribution to the human story. And it's not just superstars and religious leaders who have this story. There are women all around the world who testify right now and say, I have 4 children, there's something different about the third one, and there's something unusual happened the moment he was born or the moment he was conceived, that it was an experience of light, it was a cosmic experience, and they will begin describing the same kinds of experiences that I've just referenced. Maybe Leonardo da Vinci was one of those. And then there's another layer, another possibility, and that is that some people experience acquired savant syndrome after a close encounter. Or think about Plato and Socrates. Plato was very open in his writings, and he says he's writing for Socrates. I have a feeling he and Socrates both had this experience of having access to higher information after interdimensional contact facilitated by an altered state of consciousness. That's not my claim, that's their claim. And so it's very possible there was that kind of assistance that Leonardo da Vinci was receiving. You know, people, artists talk about the muse who inspires them in their work. It could have been something like that, but you cannot go to the museum of Leonardo da Vinci's work and art and come away not asking, how did he get that? How was he so different to his peers in that century? How was he so advanced? It has to be some explanation. And our ancestors have all those different possible explanations that I just suggested.
Exactly. Exactly. And how can you see Monet's work and not realize that he had a mystical experience with nature and could it, I mean, the fact he could do 60 paintings of the same thing, of the lily pads in his pond, and each one of them are just magnificent.
Yeah.
I went on your the Fifth Kind TV channel, which I'd love for you to explain that to the listeners as well. And I saw that you interviewed Michael Tellinger, who's a friend, who's actually, I got to videotape him in my office and hold one of those donuts. That
Oh, yes, yes.
Ooh, yeah, and I put some of my crystals in it. It was kind of fun because you could feel the toroidal energy coming off of it. And Michael Tellinger tells a story about there being more tunnels in South Africa than there were people at this at the prehistoric times.
Yes.
In South Africa, because the Anunnaki were looking for gold. And again, that goes back to the storyline of upgrading the primates, or I'm trying to think who it was. Tom Kenyon says that the elementals kept jumping in and out of monkeys, and some of them got stuck. And then from those expanded monkeys, gorillas or whatever, that's what the Anunnaki took to make us. And then Michael Tellinger tells about these, I think it was either 75,000 or 85,000 tunnels in South Africa for gold. Do you find that in any of the records as well?
Yes, I do touch on that in Escaping from Eden. And firstly, I should say I love Michael Tellinger.
Me too.
I think he's a very courageous man. And I love the research that he's done and that he has highlighted, particularly to do with what's been found in Southern Africa. So it's not just South Africa, it's a whole region straddling, I think, 4 different countries in Southern Africa, where a great network of tunnels for gold mining have been found. And it's quite difficult to date these things, but there are ways of dating rock through wear patterns, so on and so forth. And there's a reasonable consensus that what we're looking at here is a network of mining tunnels that are about 200,000 years old. Now, at that time, our ancestors were here, pretty much the same shape and size and build and posture as us, apparently not quite as clever as us, not smart enough to know how to farm or build their own cities, but smart enough to work in someone else's mine, someone else, question mark. And I do find this referenced in Genesis, because we have the story of Eden in Genesis. So you've got the region of Eden, and then you've got the enclosed zone within Eden in which our ancestors were being tweaked, adapted, modified. And in the lead up to that story in Genesis, we're told about some key mineral deposits within easy commuting distance of the enclosed zone where these workers were being created. So Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden got everything laid on, apparently. What do they need with key mineral deposits? And then there's this phrase in the Hebrew that says, and the Elohim, the powerful ones, set the humans to work.
Wow.
I don't think that means a little like gardening. And I think when we've just been told about key mineral deposits, you can join the dots and think that maybe these prehistoric minds might give us an insight as to what that work was that our ancestors were put to. And yes, there are references in Genesis. Also, as I said before, the Popol Vuh, very open in saying what our visitors wanted was a human population that would work for them.
Right.
Let us make avatars for ourselves, they said, who will do the work and bring us our food. And so that pattern of sacrificial religion, I think, is really rooted in that time when we brought to our superiors what they wanted and needed and piled it up in their treasure houses for them. I think a lot of human behavior is rooted in that time.
There's a book that I read called Transylvanian Sunrise. Have you heard of it? Transylvanian.
I know the title, but I've not read the book.
Peter Moon and Radic. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize to the listeners. I don't remember. I'll find it and put it in the information. They in I think the 90s, early 90s, through satellite imaging from above, they found caverns underneath Transylvania, and which is Romania now. And there was a hybrid human that was able to get into the force field. Lots of people passed trying to get into the force field. He was able to put his palm on the triangle door entry security and put his palm on, door opens, and inside is like Google Glass, high tables with the whole history of the earth and a big thing of ormus, a container of ormus, which is powdered gold, monatomic gold, which is what supposedly we were being used to deliver out of South Africa.
Yeah.
And when that underground cavern opened and it had all this incredible technology, apparently it automatically opened something in Iran or Iraq at the same time. So
that's interesting.
Also, yeah, I'll send you the information. Of course, these aren't religious texts, but there is proof that the CIA was very friendly with Romania during that time. And I mean, this is true. This is not fiction. This is somebody, and I guess there's 5 books. I've only read one of them. But
there is evidence of ancient technology all around the world if you're willing to listen to the indigenous stories and read the traditional texts. So you'll find it in the Popol Vuh, you'll find it in the Bible, find it in the Sumerian stories. And I've been quite confronted. One of the things that has led me from escaping from Eden to Echoes of Eden is the experience of speaking to veterans of war who have been in a situation where they are policing, defending the kind of sites that you're talking about there, Kathy. And I've spoken to quite a few veterans of war who, having returned from the 2003 incursion into Iraq, had a lot of questions about what ancient tech might be in that part of the world, and came to me to ask if I thought they were on the right track, because this was what they were hearing from their peers in the forces. And some of them had been involved in operations that were clearly archaeological and also seemed to be related to forbidden tech. Is this credible, they asked me. And I had to say, well, I can't speak from an on-the-ground, eyes-on experience in Iraq, but I can tell you that kind of tech, that part of the world, testimony of that is ages old. And I do know, because it's in the public domain, that NASA has been involved in testing the kind of technologies that are referenced in some of these ancient technologies. So as you begin joining up the dots, you realize there's a great deal of credibility to these claims and the kind of tech that you were just referencing just now, Kathy.
Well, I'm excited because I think this disclosure of alien technology is going to create the tipping point for us changing our world for the better. Because once we realize that, number one, our history is incorrect and we can really claim our true history, that's sort of a missing mystical balance or platform for us, where we're living out of a fantasy, and actually out of a control system that may not serve our highest growth, our highest evolution. Because I believe we came here to be on the cutting edge of creation, and expand with it, not be controlled by it.
Yes.
So when I read the Old Testament, I just thought that depiction was such an angry, nasty God. I was so surprised. And then, of course, Jesus is this loving creature, but the contrast of don't piss that God off, it'll kill all of us. And he does it over and over again. What did you find when you were, I mean, how did you keep your belief on, I don't know, that's a personal question, but how did you deal with the narrative?
That incompatibility that you just named is one of the things that brings people to me for coaching, because they've seen it. It's a dissonance in their own faith.
Yes.
And they found that within their faith community, it's a taboo. They can't talk about it, yet it's so obvious. And yet every preacher understands there is an apparent incompatibility between the character of God, the God character in the Old Testament, and God as Jesus reveals God in the New Testament. Preachers know this because they have to do gymnastics, mental gymnastics, to make sense and make it look like a coherent book and message. Mm-hmm. Or at least they feel they have to.
Yeah.
But that's why I find a lot of theologians, pastors who've done formal training, have a theology degree, they understand exactly where I'm coming from in my Eden books. They understand exactly what the question is that I have put back on the table. It was on the table right at the beginning of Christianity because there were foundational church fathers who were saying very plainly, if we read the Elohim stories in the Bible as if they are God's stories, we end up with a God who was a monster.
Right.
Origen, who was the founding father of Christian hermeneutics, said that if you read the Elohim stories as God's stories, you will have to believe of God things we wouldn't believe of the most savage and unjust of men.
Right.
So he's saying that can't be the right reading. And Origen went further and said that he believed what Plato had written about, other kinds of entity intersecting with human history. And we have the memory of it in these ancient Hebrew stories. That dissonance was obvious to the primitive church. If you go to Acts 15 in the New Testament, there's a moment in which they are debating whether faith in the Hebrew canon, the Old Testament stories, was going to be required for Christianity moving forward. And that council, headed up by Jesus's brother James and the apostolic leaders, said no, faith in that canon is not required for Christianity moving forward. And the only reason they were able to dispense with it in that way was because Jesus himself had distanced himself from the Elohim and Yahweh stories. And yet, somehow, we got to a position where the early church decided to glue the Hebrew scriptures onto the apostolic writings to make a Bible. People like Origen, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Marcion lost the debate. And so we ended up with this Bible of Old and New Testament with incompatible images of God. The reason that God comes across insane and violent and punitive, retributive, unpredictable, ugly, punishing people through 7 generations of their families because of something their great-great-great-great-granddad did that offended him. The reason that picture emerges is the Elohim stories are not about God. They are about a whole community of entities at war with one another. And as soon as you realize these are actually stories of ancient colonization and ET factions and draconian entities fighting against each other for hegemony and control and resources, and human beings are getting caught in the crossfire and slaughtered in their thousands because of it, as soon as you realize that's a story of colonization, it makes perfect sense.
Yes.
All colonization is like that. It's ugly, it's brutal, it's violent. The moment you say, no, all those actions are the actions of God, you've made a terrible mistake.
Right, right.
God is not like that at all. That's a community of invading entities, not the story of God. And so call it all God, and you've got God fighting against himself, making mistakes, failing to anticipate things a child could anticipate. But it's worse than that, because if that is the God of Christianity, not only do you have to accept that God, the source of the cosmos, is awful and dangerous and terrifying and vicious, you have to worship that God.
Right.
And love that God. What does that do to your conscience to worship an entity like that? What does that do to your moral judgment to worship an entity like that? If you worship an entity that will do genocide, then you will excuse genocide.
Right.
If you worship an entity that is racist, then you will accommodate racism. And that is the history of Christianity. It's there throughout. Now, it's not the whole history. Christianity is full of wonderful things as well, wonderful movements of human experience, revival, encounters with God, encounters with spirit, lives transformed. But you look at the institutional history of Christianity, and you've got slavery, you've got colonization, you've got brutalization, abuse of children, abuse of women. You can't take that out of the story of institutional Christianity, and it all goes back to getting the whole idea of God wrong by these wrong translations. Translation choices that were made in the 6th century BCE by the Jewish scribes and then reinforced by the decisions of the early church.
Right, right. Do you feel that Jesus was in India?
Oh, that's a really interesting topic. I've got 3 videos on that on my channel, the Paul Wallis channel. And short answer, yes. But then the more interesting question, when was he in India? I think it ought to be completely uncontroversial to say that by the time he was 33, Jesus may have traveled the world.
Right.
And there's a lot in his teaching that suggests he was every bit as educated and aware and intelligent as the Apostle Paul or Plato or others who had gone before him. Lots of clues that there is a knowledge of Eastern teaching in the mind of Jesus and those who wrote for him when we read the Gospels and New Testament.
Yes.
It ought to be uncontroversial to say that with his very wealthy merchant uncle, Joseph of Arimathea, he may have traveled the world. He may have gone on some business trips. He may have sat at the feet of spiritual masters in other places. There's, to my mind, no problem with saying he might have been in India in that time. The reason some Christians have a problem with that is that the church has always wanted the monopoly of information about Jesus, because the church feels its authority and credibility is dented if another culture, India, says, oh, well, we know some things about Jesus you don't know. Why should that? What's the problem with saying, oh, okay, that's interesting. You don't even have to believe everything that is carried in Indian memory, but you can at least listen to it and think, well, that is interesting. And that does sound like Jesus. And that does sound wholly compatible. And yet some people get very uppity because they want this monopoly. But more controversial than that is the claims from, for instance, out of Kashmir, that Jesus was there after the lifetime we know about in that ends in Jerusalem with his crucifixion, because Christianity traditionally understands Jesus to have survived crucifixion by a supernatural divine intervention that brings him back from death to an incorruptible, immortal condition in which he's on the planet for a few weeks, and then he returns in bodily form to this other realm, the heavenly realm, and is there forever in physical form. That's the classical understanding of resurrection.
Right.
However, we often read that in to the text. So whenever we find the English word resurrection, we think that whole story is being told us. Well, that word just means that he was again. And then there are details of the cross story that are interesting. He was on there only for 6 hours in a process that could take 6 days to kill a person. This raises some questions. When the Apostle Paul wants to insist on Jesus having transcended death, he starts quoting the Mahaparinirvana Sutra about transcending death. Why is he doing that if he's wanting to say this is a historical thing? There's something else going on there.
Yeah.
And then when you get beyond the canonical Gospels to the other documents, the Gnostic Gospels,
Yes.
and not just later documents, but if you go to something like the Gospel of Thomas, you are looking at what many scholars believe is the earliest account of Jesus's teachings. Well, then you don't have the crucifixion, resurrection, ascension story. You go to the earliest of the canonical Gospels, which is the original form of Mark, absent of this little appendix that's on it now. It doesn't have the crucifixion, resurrection, ascension story. So when you go to the earliest texts in Christianity, there's no incompatibility between what they're saying and then Japan, France, England, India saying, well, Jesus is actually here after that time. And so in my videos, I put all that out there, really as a way of saying, just be very careful how much you're reading in to the texts. If you are a believer in the classical understanding of the resurrection, you might be absolutely correct. But just be clear, that's not the only way you can read those texts. And we need to be very careful of living in a world where only one culture is allowed to speak about Jesus without any corroboration outside a tight little bunch of texts. They won't even accept other texts within their own culture. So when we're saying, well, only the writers who are writing at that time in that location are allowed to mention Jesus, and Indians, what do they know? Japanese, what do they know? You know, there's a little bit of cultural something going on there. And so my video is a little bit provocative, but I mean it to be, because I really want people to go back and say, have I read that right? And what does it really blow out of the water if I consider other interpretations of the story of Jesus?
Yes, yes.
You know, we're very protective of things we're familiar with, and not always very ready to say, have I read that right?
Well, I think the opportunity is to question this narratives anymore and to see the truth. And that's what you're doing with all of this work, is you're allowing us to question maybe something that we were conditioned with as a child or in our culture, and see if it serves anymore.
True.
The reason.
And I just want to add something, because, you know, a lot of people respond to me as if I'm out there debunking the Bible or debunking Jesus. And I would say, no, that's not my heart at all. I want to understand the Bible. I want to understand what is going on in the Bible. And I will always go back with the question, have I read that right? And similar with Jesus, a lot of people struggle because they find incompatibilities, inconsistencies in the orthodoxy they've been taught, and yet they've had a real experience in that fundamentalist church, or they know someone whose life has been transformed in this very conservative religious environment. And again, I think I would encourage people to go back and interpret what happened. What did you experience? What happened? And very often when people talk about spiritual experiences that have led them to having this very narrow orthodox view, ask them what the experience was, and they'll say, well, it was an experience of unconditional love.
Yes.
It was an experience of being at one with the cosmos and in love with everyone and everything. Well, amen to that. Yes, that was a real experience. And you can call that an experience of God, an experience of the source, an experience of the cosmos. Yes, and amen to that. But it doesn't mean that everything you heard in that church was correct, because that's where you had that experience. And I was really fortunate, coming back to your very first question about questioning the narratives, that shortly after I had an experience like that in a church in 1982, I found out that our two senior pastors disagreed on a point of doctrine that I thought was pretty fundamental. And it was such a gift to me that they were open about this with me, because it meant I've had this powerful experience, but it doesn't turn the preachers into oracles.
Right.
One of them is wrong. And that means that I have to keep on thinking and weighing things up for myself and learning and discovering. And that reframed how I understood faith. Faith is not holding hard and fast to 12 conclusions you formed 40 years ago.
Right.
It should be about discovering the truth. And that is a process, and it's a lifelong process.
Exactly. That's the exciting part of all of these changes that we're going through right now, is that we can look at things and see how they feel to us, rather than just what we were what we were happy to learn and use, and it served, but may not serve us now, because we're going through this huge opportunity to pick a better world, to pick a better way of being, to work in a non-competitive way, in a more peaceful way. And
Yes.
when you look, the reason why I asked about if Jesus in India, if you look at what Jesus taught, whether or not even the whole Bible is correct, but you look at his teachings takes the best of other religions that were that he learned from. I believe he learned from Hinduism, he learned from Buddhism, he learned he learned Muslim. He traveled that whole area. So and he learned to meditate. He learned. I mean, it's unrealistic that we shouldn't all try to get along with all the knowledge, and to be discerning and be entertained by the adventure that is unfolding. And what you're doing is giving us a chance to see it from someone who studied it and wants the mystical to be uncovered for us. Thank you for that.
Well, I find that invitation in Jesus's teaching, when you go to the root meanings of the words, once again, for me, this is always the key. And you were just saying about people having paradigm shifts. And it's interesting to me that Jesus's first sermon that he ever toured with, according to the Gospel of Matthew, was one in which he said, go beyond the mind. And very often when our worldview shifts, we'll say, I knew that was off. I knew that was off, what I've been told before. Well, where did you know? Well, you knew here. You knew here it was off.
And feel right.
And then at some point you had to do the work, the cognitive work, to get it to line up. So now when I hear Jesus saying, go beyond the mind, I hear an invitation like that. Now that text in Matthew that summarizes his gospel, the way it's translated at the moment, sounds like a grave warning. It says, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand.
Oh, yes.
And you hear words like that, and we've had 2,000 years of layering doctrine and dogma on top of that. So we think he's saying, you clean your life up because God is about to show up and you wouldn't want to offend him. That's what it sounds like.
Right.
Go to the root meanings, and he's saying, go beyond the mind. Go beyond the mind, because you say kingdom, it sounds like a feudal order with a king at the top, and then we're just there to take orders.
Yep.
Translate it as realm. It means the same thing technically, but it evokes a totally different understanding. A realm is a dimension to be explored and discovered, and how do things work here, and who's here in this realm? What beings might I encounter in this realm? Go beyond the mind, because the realm of the heavens, the skies, space, the cosmos, the whole of the cosmic realm is at hand. What does that mean? It means it can be taken hold of. It's waiting to be embraced. Go beyond the mind.
That's right.
Because the amazing powers and principles of the cosmic realm are waiting to be embraced by you. Now, could there be a bigger, more amazing, more mystical invitation than that? And as soon as you realize that's how Jesus announces his ministry, you can see he then goes on to illustrate what that looks like. And it's a totally different vision of who Jesus was, what God means, what's possible for us, that opens up through translation. That's why I love translation so much, why I make it so much a part of my books.
It makes so much sense that there's so many different ways they could have translated all of the texts, but the texts were there was a need to use them to control the masses. And even when we talked about art earlier, and we'll go full circle for just a second, the art was used in all the churches because people couldn't read. So they could see the stories in the stained glass windows, or the frescoes, or the tiles on and walk into a Byzantine church and see all that gold and go, oh, that must be God, how powerful that is. And so there was a chance for there to be an educated version and the serf, or the common man's version. And the common man's version was in the art, and only the sophisticated eye might have seen the spaceships or the clouds that didn't look like clouds, or
that's true.
That, right? Because
that's true.
It was storytelling.
It was storytelling, exactly. And there are the secrets there, for those with an eye to see. But then, yes, there was a very heavy message from empire as well, which comes over in a couple of ways. And I think you only have to get to the 500s before you're looking at Roman iconography of Jesus that makes Jesus look Italian.
Right.
And where he's in the uniform of a Roman general, which means he's below the emperor and above you. So suddenly they've sort of endorsed the feudal structure of Roman imperial society, with Jesus somewhere in the middle of it, thank you very much, looking very European. So that's interesting, because that's kind of that's how you get to white Jesus,
right?
Which is a great shame, because Jesus, as he would have looked, had a really international look.
Very dark-skinned.
He had dark skin, but you couldn't say he was black. You couldn't say he was white. He was somewhere in the middle, as people were in that part of the world. That's great choice, God, But no, the Roman Empire says, no, he's one of us. And he's somewhere in the middle of our social order. So it happened in that way. And then further into the empire, you've got portrayals of Jesus, the apostles. Oh, and there's the emperor. Or go to England, and there's Jesus, the apostles. Oh, there's the squire who paid for the painting. And again, it's wanting to anchor the pyramid of powers that particular empire's promoting, and they've hijacked Jesus to do it, just like my primary school did all those years ago. Keep the people in line.
Wow. So I'm afraid we're at the end of our show right now. We'll have to do this many more times because I
I'd
have
love
like
to.
a zillion more questions. But what is the best way, Paul, for people to be able to learn from you and grow with you and actually support what you're doing?
Well, people can contact me directly through my website, which is paulanthonywallis.com. That's Anthony with an H, Wallis, W-A-L-L-I-S, paulanthonywallis.com. If you're interested in doing personal coaching with me, come to my website and we can meet there and have a conversation from there. You can find my books on Amazon, Kindle, Barnes & Noble, Hive, Book Depository, wherever books are sold. You'll find Escaping from Eden and The Scars of Eden. Right now, you can pre-order the Kindle edition of Echoes of Eden,
Right.
and then the paperback is released on the 1st of May for
Oh,
Echoes of Eden. You're on YouTube. You can find me on the Fifth Kind TV and the Paul Wallis channel. And if you read my books and you want to have a conversation with me or even an argument with me, I'm always in the comments on those YouTube channels talking to people because I love having conversations with my readers. I am enriched by them. I learn so much from those conversations. And I just love helping people process some of what's in the book, because all the Eden books are intended as gateway books into new information, reframing of history, but then information that you want to do something about.
right.
And so those are the conversations I really love.
Yes, I'm so excited. I can't wait to read everything and follow all of your videos because I'm a big fan and I just got to meet you a couple of weeks ago. So well, because I really think this is the perfect time for us to look at our choices, and we can choose to stay in the old paradigm and hold on for dear life as everything changes, or we can look at things that enrich us and help us think better and more clearly and make better decisions. So what you're offering, Paul, thank you so much. And I hope that we'll have many more conversations.
Oh, definitely. I'd love to. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you. Bye, you guys. Please share this. Everyone needs to know about Paul Wallis. Bye.